The first question I wanted to ask is, your work bridges psychoanalysis and continental philosophy. How do you see Lacanian thought contributing to contemporary philosophical debates, such as those concerning post-humanism or deconstruction?
So I guess the context for this really is probably partly in how Lacan's ideas have been and tend to be taken up within academia, certainly in the UK, I think much more broadly than the UK, that the idea of studying Lacan within the context of philosophy studies would be very unusual, certainly in the UK. But then that same issue befalls many of the most influential names in continental philosophy. So essentially in the UK, philosophy departments have tended much more towards analytic philosophy, Anglo philosophy, American philosophy, and that's had the effect of all of these fascinating figures from particularly France in the 20th century, people like Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, being absorbed into other areas of the curriculum. So people who study Derrida, for example, tend to do within English literature departments or on courses on critical theory, that kind of thing. And those courses often involve Lacan as well, or Freud and Lacan. So people who come to Lacan through academia, certainly, often encounter Lacan at the same time as they're encountering what we might think of as fellow travelers, like Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, as I say, kind of late 20th century thinkers. So in that sense, to go to your question, how does Lacan's work contribute or intersect with those ideas? I think for many people in academia, there's already an intersection because they've encountered them through the same courses, through the same questioning. I guess the other side to that, and it's a very important other side to that, is Lacan was not a philosopher. Lacan was he was a doctor, a medical doctor, he was a psychiatrist, and he was a practicing, more than anything else, a practicing psychoanalyst. And I think that's a really important distinction to always bear in mind. I think Lacan's ideas do bear very significantly on our understanding of questions of philosophy, but Lacan himself is not a philosopher, and he's not trying to do the work of philosophy. He's trying to do something very different. And I think you see that very evidently in Lacan's own work, that there's always, although the work can be very abstract and engages in very important, very significant ideas concerning what it means to be a human being, how we interact, which then, cascades onto questions of the political, the social, the ethical. At the heart of what he's saying, he always brings it back to the clinic. So he's addressing, at least in his early work, he's addressing clinicians. There is a sense in his later seminars that he's got a broader audience and he's addressing a more philosophical audience as well as clinicians. But there's always that kind of bringing it back to the clinic, which I think is a really important aspect of understanding Lacan. There are people who see Lacan as being concerned with psychoanalysis and only psychoanalysis, that he's a clinician and his work should only be understood in terms of its clinical application. I actually would disagree with that. I think it has a huge impact on our understanding beyond the clinic, but I think it's important to remember it is articulated to the clinic, which means a couple of things. One, that provides us with context for understanding what Lacan's saying. It also helps us understand the clinic itself as being never something that's isolated from the rest of the world, the rest of society. The clinic, the world comes into the clinic. Let's put it that way. Whenever an analyst goes for psychoanalysis, they bring so much more into the clinical space. So Lacan can help us to understand that. But also, I think that emphasis on Lacan's clinical practice helps us to understand some of the limits of Lacan and what he's trying to do. And I think if we forget that and we start to treat Lacan as a philosopher, we start to misunderstand his objectives and what he's attempting to do, and his own limitations on his own arguments.
My next question is about the same topic that you just mentioned, the topic of Lacan and not being a philosopher. Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek have described Lacan as an anti-philosopher. Do you agree with this characterization, and what does it mean for the relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy?
Yeah, interesting question. I think the notion of anti-philosophy, Badiou's notion of anti-philosophy, is much more concerned with the limitations of philosophy itself. It's a meta-philosophical point, I think, that Badiou is trying to make. That the tradition of philosophy, in a sense, becomes something of an echo chamber, a closed discipline where the conversation happens amongst philosophers themselves, and it becomes this contained discipline. And I think what Badiou is very much pointing to is the emergence of certain figures within or close to philosophy who create something of an opening within philosophy that allow us to stand outside philosophy and look into philosophy without departing entirely from philosophy. And
Like Nietzsche or Kierkegaard.
yes, exactly. Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein,
Mm.
these are all figures who would, I guess, more conventionally be understood as philosophers. I mean, people would tend to think of Nietzsche as a philosopher, although, you know, he wasn't from the beginning. He was a philologist who kind of fell into philosophy, and I think a lot of people would still understand that Nietzsche is, if he is a philosopher, he's a very odd kind of philosopher. And similar with Kierkegaard. Wittgenstein is kind of interesting choice in terms of Badiou, because Wittgenstein is much more obviously working within philosophy, within the realms of philosophy itself, rather than being on the edge of philosophy like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard.
Mhm.
And I think Wittgenstein is a really interesting one for understanding Lacan's position, because I think there is a understanding Wittgenstein as an anti-philosopher is it helps to understand Lacan, to understand Wittgenstein. So through reading Lacan's interpretation of Wittgenstein, I think that's where we start to understand Wittgenstein as being closer to the margins of philosophy than he might be conventionally understood, certainly within Anglophone philosophical academia. In terms of Lacan himself, as I say, Lacan is not a philosopher, and I think that's what Badiou is doing there is really, in a sense, while he pulls figures like Wittgenstein to the edge of philosophy with the help of Lacan, he pulls Lacan closer to philosophy and allows himself to make this argument that all of these figures can be understood to be doing something similar in relation to philosophy. And I think that, speaking, I guess, particularly to your audience members who are not so familiar with Lacan's work, Lacan, despite the fact that he is primarily concerned with the practice of psychoanalysis, he engages very much with philosophy. So throughout his seminars, throughout his writings, he's picking up different figures from the tradition of philosophy and engaging with them, but always engaging with them to do particular work, to provide a particular twist. So he'll pick up a philosopher and he'll utilize that philosopher to shine a light on something or to show how an idea could be turned slightly. So it's always doing some psychoanalytic work, but it's also then inevitably giving us a reason to go back to that philosophical tradition and question that philosophical tradition itself. So I think in some ways we can read Lacan as being very critical of philosophy. He's clearly a champion of philosophy. When he talks about at least some of the philosophical figures he engages with, he's very, very positive about them. But there's always that twist where he makes the ideas do some labor that they're not used to being put to it within conventional academia. And that then gives us reason to go back and read those philosophical positions from a slightly different angle, different perspective, and then creating new ideas. And I think that's the commonality for these figures that Badiou is presenting as anti-philosophers, is they break us out of a certain slumber rather than going around the questions of philosophy, which become very repetitive. They create an opening for reconsidering the crucial issues that philosophy used to engage with.
They create, historical breakthroughs in the realm of philosophy, in other words.
Yes, and not just historical breakthroughs, but also the potential for historical breakthroughs. They create new ways of saying new things, but also I think a fresh re-engagement in the questions which have been significant in philosophy. I think there's a tendency, particularly in analytic philosophy, to reduce all philosophy to language games. It's almost as if for analytic philosophers we've answered all the big questions, or at least we've come to the conclusion that some of the big questions simply can't be answered, so we'll ignore them. And I think what these anti-philosophers do is they disrupt that convenient conclusion and say, no, there is an imperative, and through this different way of thinking, whether that be through will to power or through questions of positionality, a relationship to truth, or problematizing of the possibility of a relationship to truth, that we create an opening that then becomes an imperative or a demand to revisit these questions with new perspectives, new ways of thinking, new language. And you see that, I think, in these big names that we've mentioned, but also in a lot of the continental thinkers who picked up these big names, particularly things like Deleuze, Laruelle, but also I think amongst them, very significantly, Lacan.
Mhm. Next question, sir. Lacan's texts are notoriously dense and elliptical. Could you share your approach to unpacking his work for a contemporary audience? How do you balance fidelity to Lacan's ideas with making them accessible?
With a great deal of difficulty, and perhaps not always succeeding. I think my understanding is, first of all, we have to ask, why is Lacan so difficult? And I think there are different perspectives on that. Some people think that Lacan simply wasn't very good at presenting his ideas in a clear way. I don't think that's the case at all. I think Lacan very much makes a decision to present his ideas in a way that forces the reader or the listener to think. You can't simply absorb Lacan's ideas. You have to puzzle as to what he's saying. And there's a polyvocal dimension to Lacan's work, in the sense that he's rarely saying only one thing. He's often saying multiple things. And sometimes those multiple things don't sit terribly comfortably together, which is part of Lacan's genius, I think, to be able to do that, to make different points at the same time. But as I think if you appreciate that what Lacan was trying to do was to push his audience, if we're thinking of his seminars, or his readers, if we're thinking of his text, and push them to not simply accept his ideas, but push them to think about the points that he's trying to engage with. And there's some gambit in this, but if that's explains the complexity of Lacan's thinking, it also gives us an opening to take some of those ideas and make them less complex. So I don't think you have to reproduce Lacan's complexity to be faithful to Lacan. And I think sometimes there is a temptation to do that, to write as Lacan would write. So you end up with people almost mimicking Lacan in their style. And yeah, that's fair enough. There's no reason Lacan should have a monopoly on that desire to write in a complex way that challenges the reader. But I also think it doesn't limit us to that. I think there is space for taking Lacan's ideas and unpacking them. I think ultimately, if Lacan has something useful for us, if he has something useful to tell us, a useful insight into what it means to be a human being, how human beings interact with each other, how human beings relate to language and relate through language. If he has something significant to say on all those points, then that's something should be brought out and should be made available. And I think that's really what motivates my work, is to say, okay, rather than having a small group of people doing Lacan within small confines, this elite group of people who are reading Lacan and exchanging their ideas almost in a separate language of their own. If Lacan is really significant, then he needs to be opened up for a much bigger audience. And that's what I've tried to do in my work. Whether I've succeeded or not, I think really is a question for you and for my readers. As I say in the beginning of my book, there is in some ways an inevitable failure in what I'm trying to do, because if you try and make Lacan's work accessible, you are always going to miss something. You can't capture it all and make it accessible. So in a sense, there's a choice there. And what I've tried to do in my work is say, okay, this is not everything. I'm not going to be able to say everything about Lacan, but it's enough to open a doorway that I hope then people will walk through, and in time will engage in Lacan's own work or some of the other incredibly rich secondary literature. And if I can help people get to that work and Lacan's own work, then I've done my job and they can forget about my book completely.
As someone who teaches Lacanian psychoanalysis, what do you find to be the most challenging concepts for students to grasp? And how do you help them navigate these difficulties?
I think possibly the single biggest challenge I find is because, well, I guess for context, I used to teach within a psychology context. I don't any longer. But even outside of a psychology context, there is a tendency in our world generally to think in a very psychologized manner. So because of the dominance of academic psychology and the way that has permeated certainly Western culture, but I think probably global culture, there is a tendency to think of what it means to be human in a way that is conditioned by psychology. And I think we do this a lot of the time unconsciously. It's not a conscious choice. It's a little bit like Frederick Jameson's famous quotation about capitalism, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I think we can say the same thing about psychology. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of psychology, or is to imagine a way of thinking about human being that is outside of the psychological paradigm. And I think that's the single biggest challenge in trying to teach or write about Lacan, is that you are always writing for an audience that already have a very set notion of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a subject, to put it in Lacan's terms. And the issue that gives rise to is not so much that people then resist Lacan as an alternative, it's the fact that they start to interpret Lacan as a psychologist, and Lacan's insights then very easily become psychologized. And I think that's so far from what Lacan is trying to do, that it's something we need to be very careful that we're not presenting Lacan as simply another mode of psychology. He's actually doing something radically different from psychology and very anti-psychology. If you read Lacan's text, particularly his early text, it's full of very explicit critiques of psychology, and they're critiques for good reason. And I think, as I say, I think that's the challenge, that we need to present Lacan to an audience who, whether they're psychology students or just people who live in a world dominated by psychology, already understand the world in a particular way, and to present the ideas in such a way that we're constantly reminding the audience or the reader that these ideas are not to be psychologized, that we have to resist that temptation to psychologize them. And I think that's a very hard thing to do. I mean, I'm not even sure I managed to do that myself, because in some ways, in order to explain the concepts to people, you have to step into their territory. You have to step into their way of understanding things, and then you need to pull back from that way of understanding. So it's a curious dance you have to play, and I think a big challenge. And again, it goes back to my earlier point that if Lacan is saying something significant, if there's a lesson in Lacan was a teacher. He was trying to teach us lessons, and if those lessons are valuable and continue to be valuable into the 21st century, then we need to do that work of preserving the core, the essence of what he was attempting to do, which I think was very much a push against that solidification of ideas and that, let's say, very psychologized conception of what it means to be a human being.
So the next question is a bit more complex than the previous ones. It's about the ethical act. Lacan's notions of the ethical act is a profound and radical concept in his psychoanalytic theory, particularly as it relates to desire, subjectivity, and the symbolic order. The ethical act represents a moment of profound subjective transformation and fidelity to one's singular desire, often at the cost of significant personal or social disruption. Your work frequently intersects Lacanian psychoanalysis and ethics. How would you describe the ethical implications of Lacan's act and its role in achieving subjective transformation?
So I guess it helps to start with unpacking a little bit what we mean here by the ethical act. So for Lacan, when we talk about an act, he has a very specific concept he's trying to mobilize. Lacan makes a clear distinction between what he calls mere behavior and the act. So for Lacan, the act is when you put it in very simple terms. the act is when you make a decision to act. And by decision, he doesn't simply mean, I decide I'm going to drink some tea, so I drink some tea. It's taking that decision to a profound, let's say, subjective or psychoanalytic level. Lacan's point is that most of the time, we engage in mere behavior. We follow well-trodden paths. We follow ingrained behaviors that we have as subjects, but also more broadly than that, social behaviors. We follow the rules. We follow the unspoken rules of society. We accept ways of doing things. We're conditioned by language, so we follow the rules of language, not just in the sense of how we speak or how we communicate, but also the implications of being a subject in language that conditions how we think or what we feel is possible to think. Occasionally, we break out of that, or occasionally we're faced with a circumstance that creates the possibility of breaking out of that, which is what Lacan referred to as a step into the real. We step outside the pre-given or preconditioned situation that we're in, where there is no external explanation or justification for the decision that we make, for the act that we choose to engage in. And it's that point where we step outside, where we are, to put it in ethical terms, we are assuming entirely on ourselves the responsibility for the decision that we choose, what we choose to say, what we choose to do, the act that we choose to engage in. This, for Lacan, is the ethical act. And as you said in your question, it relates to Lacan's idea of subjective transformation, precisely because at this moment, or in this moment, we choose who we are. And it's only in this moment that we choose who we are. At every other moment, we're part of, let's say, a machine that is moving on. We're part of the constant movement of language. We are part of a culture. We're part of a society. We're operating within that. It's only at the point where we step outside that we assume full responsibility for our position as a subject, which for Lacan is this radical move outside of the conventions. Which is not to say the ethical act needs to be, let's say, conventionally unconventional. For Lacan, it's to do with the assumption of responsibility. So it may be what you're choosing to do on the surface is very conventional, but the distinction for Lacan there is you are making the choice to do it. You're not simply doing it because it's a convention. You're choosing to do it, and you're choosing the responsibility. And in that sense, Lacan, I think, is promoting the idea of this ethical act, that we should be assuming responsibility for our decisions, or we have a choice. We have the choice to assume responsibility for our decisions, or we have the choice to simply be part of a machine. And it's only at that point of taking that weight on ourselves, that weight being the weight of our own desire, the weight of our actions, the weight of the ramifications of the decisions. It's a step away from, oh, I did it because I thought I should. I did it because those are the rules. That's the law. So to act in an ethical way for Lacan doesn't mean going against the law, but it means necessarily going outside the law. So it may be your actions are all, in an empirical sense, perfectly in line with the law, but in a structural sense, then they're not, because you're acting the way you're acting because you choose to act in that way, rather than because you're told to act in that way.
So then how does this concept align with or challenge classical ethical theories like Kantian or utilitarian ethics?
I think in two significant and possibly overlapping ways, I think. Most traditional ethical theories ultimately boil down to a kind of an assumed ground that's, so why should I do this? Because an authority tells you to do this. It would be one kind of classical approach. So there's always a ground. That ground historically has tended to be God, so because morality, or God as the author of morality, tells us to do so. Lacan, being a post-Nietzschean, is operating in a space where an appeal to God is simply not going to work. So he's trying to construct an ethics without this ground on which it can base, which is that's the big challenge Lacan faces. He's not alone in this. I don't think he's the only thinker from the 20th century who's working to produce an understanding of ethics which can continue to operate without a ground on which it can sit. But he is, I think, one of the most significant. The other important aspect of this, and it kind of goes back to the point I was making about psychologization, that because Lacan is operating from a Freudian perspective, he always brings the unconscious into the equation. And this gives us a very different way of thinking about what it means to be a human being. Philosophers have tended to operate on the equation that thinking equals conscious thinking. So when Kant, the utilitarian Mill, Bentham, and even earlier than that, when people like Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, they're all writing about, particularly in terms of ethics, they all make the assumption that the behavior that we're talking about, the decisions we're talking about, are conscious decisions. So we're talking about the ethics of the conscious mind. And Lacan, with his Freudian insights, Freudian influence, allows us to then think of ethics when not only a significant part, but the more significant part of what we govern our actions is beyond the conscious mind. So you start to think of thinking as something really radically different from the way thinking is presented within a philosophical tradition, and thinking of subjectivity in a way that's radically different from the philosophical, psychological thinking. And that then impacts on the construction of ethics, how we think of ethics, and more than that, how we think of the possibility of our own responsibility, our own position within that ethicality. It's very simplistic in some ways to think of ethics as conscious ethics, because everything is out there, everything is transparent. But as soon as you start to fold in the idea of this influence of an unconscious, whether you think of that in terms of a more Freudian unconscious, which is much more individual, or this idea of the unconscious being particular to the particular individual, or in terms of Lacan, we have this idea of a more kind of intersubjective unconscious. Either way, it introduces a facet of the subject which is necessarily beyond control, which then complicates how we interact with ethics and how we sit in relation to ethics.
The next question is about Lacan and Nietzsche. Lacan and Nietzsche both grapple with the dynamics of desire and will. Do you see any fruitful parallels or tensions between Lacan's jouissance and Nietzsche's will to power?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a very insightful answer to that, but I think it's maybe the topic for a future book. It's a really interesting way to think of it. It's not a way I'd really thought about it before. I think Nietzsche's notion of will does relate to Lacan's understanding of drive. And I think the drive in Lacan is, to me, the drive is the most complex part of Lacan's theory. It's the most difficult to grasp of all the concepts in his theory. So he talks in his earlier work about desire, and I won't say desire is straightforward in Lacan, but it's not so difficult to grasp what he means by desire, how desire relates to the phantasmatic objects, and that work in the early seminars, particularly in Seminar 7. There seems to be a clarity of thinking there that's kind of reasonably straightforward. We can grasp it, we can understand what it does. As Lacan moves, particularly after Seminar 11, into the greater focus on drive, I think things become much more complex. And I think there's a very strong Nietzschean dimension there, which is never really made terribly overt. But that idea that we have in Nietzsche of a will that's a will that pushes us. I'm trying to not use the word drive, but a will that's that courses through us, that is not reducible to us ourselves, that's beyond us, that's in us but beyond us, I think is very much what Lacan is trying to get to with the drive. So I see that strong link there. It's not something I've explicitly written on. It's something I'm keen to explore further, but I think there is a very close link between that concept of will in Nietzsche and the concept of the drive. That then would relate to a particular understanding of jouissance, in the sense that the drive can be articulated to an idea of jouissance, and that there's a particular jouissance, particularly the jouissance of a kind of asubjective repetition, which manifests from the drive, which is very distinct from the idea of jouissance in relation to desire, which is much more about attaining the object and attaining this this impossible satisfaction. In the later Lacan, the idea of jouissance becomes more attainable, but it's a very different kind of jouissance that we're attaining, and it's not a personal jouissance. And I think that's where the Nietzschean angle really comes in. I mean, I've lost the audio on you.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I was saying your response was very interesting, sir. And the next question is again about the relation of psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and in relation to philosophy. Lacan often engaged with philosophers like Hegel, Heidegger, and Descartes. Which philosophical influence do you think is most underexplored in understanding Lacan's work, and how might it illuminate his theories?
I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I think there are probably multiple answers to it. I think, as you say, Lacan engages with various philosophical voices throughout his work, and often, moving by big steps between philosophers in his different work. My immediate thought there was possibly Wittgenstein, but that's possibly because I've been reading seminar 16 and 17, so I've been thinking about that. But there's not a lot of work done on Lacan and Wittgenstein. I think Lacan helps us to understand Wittgenstein in a way, particularly early Wittgenstein, in a way that is really fresh, and it's probably would be very unpopular with Wittgensteinians, but it allows us to see something incredibly radical in Wittgenstein's early work, and I think there is space for a lot more work to be done on that. So that's one underdone part. The other one is Heidegger, and I think the influence of Heidegger on Lacan is particularly early Lacan is enormous. Lacan makes explicit reference to Heidegger. He visited Heidegger, so there's that kind of
notions like Kairos and Chronos.
Yes, I mean it's this. The influence there is very direct. We're talking about Wittgenstein. Lacan is, he takes a particular part of Wittgenstein. He's mobilizing Wittgenstein to make a particular argument. I think Heidegger's influence is much more dispersed in Lacan, and in that sense, much deeper. But there's very little work done on, or very little good work done on Lacan and Heidegger. So I think this, again, it's an area that needs to be explored a lot more. There is a very good book by Christoph Tombras on Lacan and Heidegger, which is fantastic, but there aren't a lot of them. So I think there's more work to be done there. Yeah, I mean, the other one, actually, I think this is kind of almost moving in the opposite direction. And it's not someone Lacan writes about or engages with, but rather someone who engages with Lacan, is the work of Francois Laruelle, who there are really interesting intersections between Lacan's work and Laruelle's work. And again, that's an area which I think is really ripe for exploration now. I'm not aware of anyone having written anything or having written anything accessible on Lacan and Laruelle, but I think that's work that needs to be done, because I think Laruelle's work in itself is incredibly groundbreaking, exciting, novel. Laruelle's work makes me excited about ideas in a way that very few thinkers I've encountered recently, very few do this. But also there is that intersection with Lacan's ideas, which coming from a Lacanian background makes me particularly excited. He helps us to understand aspects of Lacan in ways which are unconventional within Lacanian circles. So I think we're talking philosophical interactions with Lacan. I think, to me, that's the most exciting one at the moment, rather than the philosophers of old who Lacan wrote about. It's the philosophers, the contemporary philosophers, or almost contemporary philosophers, who we can bring into conversation with Lacan.
Both Lacan and existentialists, like Sartre, Heidegger, explore themes of lack and incompleteness. How do Lacan's ideas about lack differ from existentialist notions of nothingness or anxiety?
But I think in many ways, this goes back to the point I was making earlier about the unconscious. I think Lacan, because he's not a philosopher, is bringing a different conception of the subject to play than the philosophers are doing. And part of that is that he keeps an emphasis all the time on the unconscious. If you look at particularly Sartre and Lacan, there are a lot of overlaps between Sartre and Lacan. You can see often their ideas are pushing in similar directions. But Lacan always does something slightly different because he has this understanding of the subject as divided between consciousness and the unconscious, which Lacan is, Sartre is much more in the tradition of philosophy, even though he's saying something new within terms of philosophy. He's still working within that tradition where thought equals conscious thought. And I think that then introduces a different understanding of what lack would be, because lack then for Sartre is much more experiential lack, whereas for Lacan, lack is much more existential. It's structural, which gives us a different relationship to lack and a different relationship to the possibilities that we face in encountering that lack.
The next question is about Zizek's work and its relation to the Kantian Sublime. The concept of the real has often been compared to the Kantian Sublime, particularly in Zizek's readings. How do you see Lacan's real aligning with or departing from philosophical notions of the Sublime?
I guess again a huge question, which maybe deserves the treatment of a book. Lacan himself engages very explicitly with Kant and writes about the Kantian Sublime in Seminar 7. So there is clearly not just an overlap, but an engagement there. But interestingly, to go to the heart of your question, when he does engage with the Sublime, Lacan is not treating it as the real at all. And he's not treating it as the real because I guess he understands the Sublime much more in an imaginary way. So he's concerned with the subject's interaction with the Sublime, and the Sublime then maybe the beyond, which is then is tempting to see it as the real, but it's always the subject's imagination or imaginarization of the beyond. So it becomes an imaginary facet. And I think it's between those two things we probably find something quite generative, something quite productive to think about, that how is it we think about the Sublime as opposed to what is the Sublime in itself. And it is not to reduce it to one of those or the other, but it's keeping both those understandings in mind, which Lacan allows us to do. So in a sense, we have the real Sublime and the imaginary Sublime, and the two coexist without us having to boil it down to one as opposed to the other.
I agree. It was a question that requires a book to get to the bottom of it. The next question, sir, is about Kairos and Chronos. And Lacan distinguishes between Chronos, the linear and measurable time, and Kairos, the opportune transformative moment. How do these two concepts of time interact with the analytic process?
So I think the key to understanding Lacan's treatment or understanding of time is the idea of afterwardness, the idea that our experience is always posited retroactively. So the idea of conventional linear time is an abstract ideal. It's how we think about time, but not how we experience time. And as an analyst, Lacan is much more interested in how we interact with time. And even empirically, if you think about the analytic process, that you go along to see your analyst, or you go into Zoom to see your analyst, but you have that moment. It's almost like a bubble within the linear time of your week. You go along once a week, or 2, 3, 4 times a week to see your analyst. The analysis happens within those periodic bubbles, but those periodic bubbles themselves are always reaching backwards and forwards to the experiences that you're bringing into the analytic session, forwards into the experiences you're projecting in the future, your plans, your desires, your intentions. And that model immediately allows us to appreciate a very different experience of time. The time is simply not experienced in a linear fashion. Psychoanalysis couldn't work if time was simply experienced in a linear fashion, unless you had your analyst simply walk around everywhere with you all the time, trying to do analysis in the here and now permanently. That's not how psychoanalysis works. Psychoanalysis works through the retrospective construction of a history that is brought into the psychoanalytic moment. So it's this constant movement backwards and forwards, always reaching back and putting things into a constructed context. And that underscores, I think, again, going back to your earlier question about ethics, that for Lacan, the ethics of psychoanalysis is about that moment, about that appreciation, not simply on a conscious academic level, but that appreciation on a more profound level, that the experiences that make us what we are, and the experiences that we carry into the future, are constructed by ourselves through the narratives that we put in place. Whether you're putting those narratives in place in an analytic context, which is what Lacan's primarily interested in, or simply the narratives we put in place for ourselves. Because although I'm talking about the analytic experience where you have these periodic bubbles when you're in analysis, we have similar bubbles as we converse with ourselves. So in a sense, we are all engaged in analysis throughout our lives, through the conversations we tell, the versions of ourselves that we construct in relation to or in conversation with other people, or simply in conversation with ourselves. And the ethical moment is when those stories become owned, where we say, this is the story that I made. There were choices there to emphasize different aspects of this story, rather than this being pre-given, that it's not my parents who made me who I am, it's not my childhood, my schooling, it's actually me now who fashions the narrative that I assume to underpin me. And it's that assumption that is my assumption of my subjective position, which is the core ethical moment for Lacan.
Lacan introduced variable length sessions, arguing that the session should end at the critical point of realization or resistance. How do you, obviously for the neurotic subject, and not going into any more details. And how do you respond to critics who claim this practice undermines the stability and predictability essential for the therapeutic alliance?
Well, my simple reaction to that is that they would be missing the point. I think Lacan's point is precisely to undermine the stability. The stability is a comfort. I can appreciate from in certain modes of therapy, counseling, where people in certain conditions require the support of a counselor. They need someone to be there. Therefore, they need a structure. They need that framework to feel secure. I can totally understand that. And I don't think it would be un-Lacanian to provide that structure when that structure was necessary. If that's what your patient, your analyst needs, then I think it would be the right thing to provide that. But Lacan's fundamental point is that we become very used to the rhythm of an analytic session. If you go for analysis and you're working in a 50-minute session, either consciously, because it's 50 minutes and there's a clock on the wall and you can see when the 50 minutes is about to finish, or unconsciously, because you simply, we are rhythmic bodies. We can, we get a sense of when 50 minutes is going to be up. We can time the end of the analysis to our own advantage. And Lacan's point is our own advantage is often our own disadvantage, because what we want to do is stay in the rut that we're in. And the point of the analysis is to break the analyst out of that rut. So we stay in our own suffering. And if you're going to psychoanalysis, the point is to find a way to move outside that suffering. And you need the help of the analyst to do that. And one of the fundamental operations the analyst can engage with to create that is to break the time. So when someone is just going around in a circle with the same narrative, then it can be very productive to cut it short and say, okay, see you next week, or see you in an hour, or see you tomorrow. Equally, however, if somebody is talking in an analytic context and things are moving in a very productive direction, to then say, oh, that's 50 minutes up, I'll see you next week, could be unhelpful or even devastating. So to have that ability as the analyst to make the choice, and it becomes then for Lacanian analysts a kind of the fundamental tool of analysis, that ability to say, after 10 minutes, we're going to stop the session here, or to allow the session to go on
more
for
than 50, more than 50 minutes. Yes.
Yeah.
Critics have argued that Lacan's practice of adjusting session fees based on the analysand's means could be seen as arbitrary or even exploitative. How might this approach be defended as ethical or even essential to psychoanalysis?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know in reality how carefully this is practiced. I know a lot of analysts will have nominal fees that they charge, and then they go up and down a little bit from that. So it's not truly variable. It's not the case of the analyst sitting down and starting from nothing and saying, okay, how are we going to determine the fees? So I think it is a tricky one. I mean, in a kind of simplistic way, having some kind of means testing for analysis seems a reasonable thing to do. I think the psychoanalytic dimension in that is not simply doing an objective means testing where you say you have a certain fee for students and a certain fee for people in employment, or a higher fee for people in a higher tax bracket. And that's one way you could do it. By bringing it down to the individual subject, what Lacan is advocating is that the fee becomes articulated, or is an articulation of the subject's desire. So essentially, it's a confrontation with the subject to say, what is this worth to you? I think that works very well in the abstract. It's kind of a neat idea. How that's actually practiced, or how well that's actually practiced, I'm not so sure. I know of people who've sought analysis and have not felt they were able to take up the analysis because they couldn't pay the fee that the analyst was asking them to pay. I know in other circumstances of people who pay, are very happy with the fee they're paying and could easily pay more, but very few of us are going to advocate paying more than we're asked to pay. So I'm not sure how well it works in practice, but I think that the theory has some volume in it.
Lacan wrote in his paper titled Neurotics, Individual Myth in 1979. With this context in mind, I have a question. Psychoanalysis, I must recall, by way of preface, is a discipline which among the sciences appears to us in a truly singular position. It is often said that psychoanalysis is not, strictly speaking, a science, which seems to imply, by contrast, that it is quite simply an art. That is erroneous if one takes it to mean that psychoanalysis is only a technique, an operational method, an aggregate of formulas. But it is not erroneous if you use this word art in the sense in which it was used in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, to speak of the liberal arts. That series going from astronomy to dialectics, by way of arithmetic, geometry, music, and grammar. Critics have questioned whether Lacanian psychoanalysis produces measurable outcomes compared to other approaches such as CBT and other empirical psychological approaches. How would you respond to demands for empirical or Popperian evidence-based validation of Lacanian methods based on this quotation from Lacan?
So I think the fundamental problem here is, what measure are you using to measure these different therapeutic interventions? The tendency within academia is to take the measures of success of CBT and then say, how does psychoanalysis measure up to that? And obviously, the cards are already stacked there. You're taking the measures of CBT and using that as a way of measuring psychoanalysis, then it's simply not going to work. And if you flip the whole thing around and said, okay, we'll take the measures of success of psychoanalysis and use that to evaluate other therapeutic processes, similarly, it's not going to work. So there's an obviousness at play there. I think there are a few interrelated aspects to this. One, as you touch on, the notion of science, that I think, as your question already suggests, we have the common contemporary understanding of science is very far removed from the historical understanding of science. And we've become very enslaved to a very particular notion of science, which is often more related to technology than it is to science, and is then so bound up with economy, with capital, that the two become wedded together. That's what is good science is what is profitable science. And you can see that very easily in something like CBT. CBT is not primarily driven by what is in the best interest of the subject, the patient. CBT is driven by what is efficient, and efficient there understood in a very economic sense. What works within 6 sessions, 30-minute sessions, what will work to get the person out the door, off the books. You can tick their name off. They've been not necessarily cured, but sorted so that they can exit the therapy division. Often with the idea of going back to work. That seems to be what it's about, is getting people back into the economy. So the objectives are incredibly disparate there. The objectives of psychoanalysis is not to get someone back to work. It's not to give them a structure so that they can operate more effectively within society. That's not the objective. Psychoanalysis is a much more open-ended objective. In essence, it doesn't have an objective. It's part of the objective of psychoanalysis is to discover the objective as you go along. So there's no way that you could measure the two. To use Lacan's very famous phrase, there's no meta-language, and there's no meta-therapy. There's no therapy that sits outside of these disciplines that we could use as a fair or reasonable measure of all of them. And this kind of goes back again to your point about science, that to understand psychoanalysis as a science, or understand psychoanalysis in relation to science, we have to understand science differently. And Lacan himself is challenging that notion of science, and he's not seeking to position psychoanalysis as non-scientific. He's positioning it in relation to science, but it's in relation to a much more carefully thought out idea of science, which includes an understanding of science as being non-universal, that it's not, science is not this objective version of the world. Lacan understands science as a construct. It's something, it's a particular tradition with a particular way of doing things that creates a particular subjective position. And because it's become the dominant field, or a dominant field in our culture, it's important then to understand the subject of science, because the subject of science is who we're likely to encounter within analysis.
Sir, do we have time for 4 more questions, or is the time up?
I have another meeting in 8 minutes, so maybe time for one more question.
Okay. One more question, okay. 2 short questions I will ask, very quick. You incorporate examples from popular culture to elucidate Lacanian concepts. Could you share an example of how this method helps in demystifying his theories?
Yeah, I mean, I think in simple terms, and the reason I use it is it provides a point of access for people, that if people are engaged in the popular culture, they've enjoyed it. For example, at the end of my book, I use an example from Spider-Man, and it's a big popular movie. Yeah.
But Derek Cook,
yes,
suggested it to you.
He did, yes. And then that idea of something that people have already engaged with, it just gives that kind of level of accessibility for conveying the ideas. I think another very good example would be the film Barbie. I don't know if Barbie was popular in Iran, but certainly very, very popular here. And if you watch the film, I actually watched the film after I'd written the book, or I would have included it in the book, but it's full of what could be understood as Lacanian concepts. It's almost as if the film has been written from a Lacanian perspective already, but without mentioning Lacan. So it's full of these ideas. And I think that speaks to part of this, that it's, one, if Lacan's ideas are as good as we think they are. They should be able to explain aspects of popular culture. But also, if Lacan's ideas are as solid as we think they are, the popular culture should help us to understand the Lacanian ideas. But also, I think because Lacan has been so influential, his ideas have been taken up by the people who make the popular culture. So, film being the obvious example. A lot of people who, a lot of filmmakers will have studied film at university or college, and a lot of them will have encountered Lacan when they did. So it's not simply we're bringing disparate things together. These people have already ingested this theory. You think of people like Christopher Nolan, the filmmaker. He's certainly read Zizek. I imagine he's read Lacan. And we see this among many filmmakers. And Lacanian ideas are kind of bubbling there, maybe not consciously, but they're bubbling there nonetheless.
And the last one, for readers interested in delving deeper into Lacanian theory after reading your book, which text would you recommend as the next steps?
So I guess it partly depends which direction you want to take into Lacan, or what's motivating you to read Lacan. So at the end of the book, I do give quite a lot of suggestions of books that you might want to take up. A lot of people certainly here read Lacan because they're interested in social issues and politics. So there's a vast literature within Lacanian work on that. There are people, as you kind of suggested with some of your questions, more interested in the philosophical direction. There's also, as we've just been talking about, film theory. Lacan is taken up quite a lot by film theorists. So it kind of depends really what direction you want to take through Lacan. If you're interested in reading Lacan's texts themselves, then I imagine you're aware of, myself and Derek Hook and Stijn van Hoel have been producing commentaries on Lacan's creeds. I think that's a good place to work. I would always encourage people to get to reading Lacan himself as soon as they can. I'm hopeful that my book provides that step into engaging with Lacan's work, but the guides to the Creed that we produced are a really useful prop for doing that. Bruce Fink would be a good tip. You mentioned Derek Hook earlier. Derek Hook's work is a fantastic and accessible body of work on Lacan. I guess an obvious one to go to next would also be my book on Lacan's ethics, which I think is quite a useful next step from this book. It's a lot denser, but it's still reasonably accessible, and has that kind of obvious through line that it has the same authorial voice. But there are more and more books being produced on Lacan. There are lots of really useful